Hi, this is Justin for CGT345, and this week I'm going to show my contribution to the game. This week's theme was No Turning Back, and so me and Jordan were in a group together, and we wanted to make a psychological horror game in which things would spawn behind you and they'd damage you if you looked at them. So I was in charge with level design, and I also did a lot of work on meshes, materials, and blueprints for the for two of the objects, the cursed object and the first person character. So I'll start off with level design. So the level's assets were all from the Unreal Engine store, and they used the Ice asset pack from Infinity Blade 2. While the level overall is a big corridor, wind and loop back on itself as much as I can, especially since um, especially since a major part of our game was not being able to turn around. So we wanted to occasionally show the player the effects of turning around. So that's why we wanted to have it loop over itself. I also tried to tell a bit of a story with this. A lot of the cursed objects are either gravestones or frozen mannequins, and the mannequins themselves kind of help tell the story. So as you progress further along the level, you'll see that there are more man-made structures, such as wooden stakes, and there are also more mannequins, and a lot more of them are in a certain pose, which is as if they're shielding themselves from something. And you also see more and more debris from carts and other pieces of wood, and then finally you get to this huge stake between this rock formation, and as you go through it, this giant obelisk is framed by the stakes, and it's implied that the obelisk is what's making all of the mannequins freeze up and curse them. You can see around the obelisk that there are many more stakes here, as if someone was trying to contain the obelisk and it clearly failed. There are also these glowing rocks in the air that pulse with this red energy, and that's also meant to have a bit of the, and that was also meant to tie in with the cosmic horror theme of the level. And as you look up, there are these even bigger shards that are just floating in the air. And this is emphasized with some exponential height fog that I put in, as well as the direction of the light, which creates these light shafts and washes the entire scene in this kind of red and black color. There are lots of trees on top of the rock formations on either side of the level, and this is just to create more of a silhouette. And I focused on silhouette a lot. I used a lot of dead trees, which have these really twisting shapes as their branches, and I think that also tied in with the horror theme. So, due to the limited visibility of the level, because the player is funneled along these paths by these big rock formations, they can't see much of the world until they get to the final obelisk. So, the cursed objects work like this. They don't appear in the level at all. When you turn around and turn back, they'll have appeared. And these can be a manner of different tombstones or different mannequins. They also follow you as you turn around. So if you're looking at them and you move from one place to another, they won't follow you. But when you turn around and look back, they'll start pointing at you. And also when you look at them, then you'll take sanity damage, which is the challenge of the game. You have to get through to the end of the level without dying from insanity. When you take insanity damage, there's this visual effect that happens on your screen, and also the material of the cursed object turns red. So the way I did this was with a BP cursed blueprint, and this is just a blueprint, and it takes a static mesh as a parameter. So that means that my cursed object can be anything from a tombstone to a mannequin, or even the obelisk at the end. I think that's a cursed object as well. So the way the blueprint works is that on begin play, it checks some parameters, which is always visible and is able to rotate, because there are some cursed objects that I always want to be in the scene. For example, some of the tombstones at the start, I don't want them to just appear behind the player, I just want them to be there. And also is able to rotate, just decides whether or not they will look at you when you're turned around. So some objects like tombstones, you might not want them to always face the player because that might be weird. But for the statues, it's something that we wanted to do. First, the parameter is set as the static mesh passed into the blueprint. Then I override any default collision of the mesh just in case. And then I set the material to a special material that I made called emissive. It then checks to see if the object is always visible or not. And if it is, then the collision is enabled. If not, then then the parameter is visible is set to false, and the collision is set to query only and no physics collision, and also it's set to invisible. Um, Now, there is a bit of a bug, and it is to do with this query only collision. So for some reason when I put the is always visible variable in, and change my code around that, the collision would act as if it's blocking the player as well, which didn't happen before the is always visible parameter. And I've narrowed it down to that specific block of code commented there because I'd change it and it would never act as what it said, which was really weird. So because of that, the design of our level also changed. Since you can't walk through a cursed object, then we put them all towards the sides of the levels instead of all the way through as we originally planned. We also wanted the player to feel more scared as they spawned more and more mannequins. So we also have this parameter called sanity target, which is basically a check that says that the um, the mannequin will only spawn if the player's sanity is below a certain point. But we didn't end up doing this because of the weird collision problem. It does work though. So this is the code that checks whether or not the mannequin's in the view or not. In hindsight, we could have changed this. We could have attached the visibility and collision of the mesh to this as well, and instead of the way that we did it. But I got this solution online, and basically it just checks to see if if the current object is within the player's viewport or not. I changed it a little as you would still see them rotating if they were on the very edge. So it checks to see if it's within um, the viewport size multiplied by 2.5 on the x and y axes. Every event ticket checks to see if it's in view. If it's able to rotate as well, then it uses find look at rotation to point both of the objects towards each other, and that's how we get some of the cursed objects to follow the player where some of the others don't. If it is in the viewport, we set the glow parameter to the emissive material. So the emissive material here is just it's just the normal stone material, but I added a few parameters to make it glow. So there's a parameter called emissive parameter, which is multiplied with the color red, which in turn is multiplied with the base color channel, and that goes into the emissive color. So on when the emissive parameter is 0, it doesn't glow. When it's 1, it does. So here you can see that you can use any sort of object as the cursed object, and that you can change both the sanity target, the visibility, and the rotatability of the object in the overview. So with the first person character, this is mostly how everything's calculated. The main character has a bunch of things attached to the camera. So there's a spotlight which shows you what you're pointing at, and on that spotlight there's also a collision cone. That's how we figure out if the player's looking at something or not. We didn't want to do it on the entire viewport because that could make them lose the game really easily. So we had a small cone sticking in front of the player, which if something collides with it, then that's what causes damage. And this cone is also the same size as the spotlight. Um, there's also a backwards facing cone attached to the camera that collides with any potential cursed objects and makes them appear in the level. So this is the blueprint for the player character. It's pretty big, and I'm going to break it down here. So these three events are the collision events, and all they do is check to see on collision with the facing hitbox, it just says the boolean is looking at cursed to true or false. On the backwards hitbox, it checks the sanity meter as well as the sanity target of the cursed object, and it makes it visible and collidable. So this is the main body of the code. First, it creates the health widget, which is the little bar at the top left of the screen. Then it also checks to see if the player is dead or not. So if sanity equals 0, then it will create the dead. It will go into the dead state, and also it checks to see if the player is looking at anything. So if he's not dead, if he's looking at a cursed object, then I start a timer. This timer is a timer of 1 second, and basically, if the player is looking at a cursed object or is within a cursed state for more than a second, then he'll take damage. If I'm getting cursed by an object, the color of the object will also change. So that's where I send a value into the glow parameter, which is actually the insanity timer. And the insanity timer goes into the glow parameter, which goes into the emissive glow parameter. The timer directly influences how much the object glows by. There's also a setting for cast failed. That's any other object that causes damage, such as the spotlights, which Jordan was in charge of. And finally, if the cursed object isn't colliding with the player at the moment, then the glow parameter is set to 0 and the insanity timer is also reset. So the effect of taking damage is a post-process camera effect. It was really difficult to show the player was taking damage if he was looking at something because the health is just a small widget in the upper left corner. So what it does, it takes the current post-process settings of the player and then it adds chromatic aberration, bloom intensity, and vignette intensity. And it adds that on top of what the player's settings are already. So these are also set to flicker, and the amount of flicker increases based on the sanity timer. There are also a few more settings just to make the effects stronger or weaker based on what they are. Finally, this is the code for taking away sanity. The most important part is that it leads to a function called camera based on insanity, which is the other half of the post process effect. So, the other half of the post process effects, it was really important to make these different from the taking damage effects, but basically, as the player's sanity decreases, the saturation, bloom intensity, vignette intensity, and film grain will increase on the player's screen. And if the player's intensity gets to 0, it creates a dead widget, and then it creates a few post-process settings on the camera, and it also sets the game to pause. So that's our death state. With There's also another type of emissive material called emissive passive, and this is for big floating shards in the sky. Since the cone isn't really going to intersect with them, but we wanted them to glow anyway, it's just the ordinary emissive material, except the glow effect is linked to a sine wave that has a ceiling of 0.3, and then that goes into the lerp alpha channel, which lerps between the red color and the base color of the material. Finally, I also created some static meshes. Um, the original one was this T-posing mannequin, and we thought that it would be really unsettling to have all these T-posing mannequins constantly facing you in the game. But we also created two others. So these are so one of them is running in a direction, and the other one is shielding its face. We also created these different versions of the mannequins as static meshes instead of skeletal meshes because um, the cursed blueprint only takes static meshes and doesn't handle skeletal meshes. That was the end of this week's prototype. Um, I put a lot of effects and other things, and hopefully it's an appropriately scary game.